Let me tell you something that would have stopped my grandmother's heart cold, something so ordinary in the world today that most people do it without a second thought. They throw away bread. A loaf goes a little firm, a little dry, a few days past its best, and into the bin it goes, and a new loaf is bought, and no one thinks a thing of it. In my grandmother's kitchen, in the kitchen I was raised in, and in the kitchen where I sit today, that has never once happened, and it never will. Not a heel, not a crust, not a single stale slice is ever thrown away. And it is not merely that we are too thrifty to waste it, though we are thrifty and proud to be. It is that we know something the modern world has forgotten. We know that a stale loaf of bread is not garbage. It is a treasure, a whole cupboard of good meals waiting to be made, and in some of the finest dishes our people prepare, only stale bread will do, and fresh bread would spoil the recipe. Today I'm going to teach you every way we use a stale loaf, so that you too may look at yesterday's bread not as waste to be thrown out, but as the beginning of something wonderful. Let me be honest and plain with you first, as is my way, about what is really happening to that loaf as the days pass, for once you understand it, everything else makes sense. Most folks believe that bread goes stale because it dries out, and there is a little truth in that, but it is not the whole of it, and it is not even the main of it. The real thing that happens is a change deep in the very stuff of the bread, in the starch of it, a slow rearranging that happens as the bread cools and sits, whether it dries or not. That is why bread sealed up tight in a bag, losing no moisture at all, still turns firm and dull within a few days. It is not the water leaving, it is the starch changing. And here is the wonderful part, the part that unlocks half of what I'm about to teach you. That change can be undone by heat. When you warm a stale loaf, the starch relaxes back toward what it was, and the bread comes soft and fresh again for a little while. So, the very first thing to know about a stale loaf is that it is not as far gone as it looks, and a bit of heat can bring much of it back. Let me show you that first, the plain reviving of a stale loaf. For it is the simplest use of all, and it feels near to a miracle the first time you see it. Take your stale loaf, and if it is very dry, run your hand under the tap and wet the crust just a little, or wrap it in a slightly damp cloth. Then put it into a hot oven for a few minutes, 10 minutes or so for a whole loaf, less for a piece. What comes out is a loaf with a crackling, crisp crust and a soft, warm crumb within, very nearly as good as the day it was baked. It will not stay that way, mind you. Once revived, a loaf goes stale again faster than before, and worse, so you must eat it that same day. But for putting a tired loaf back on the supper table warm and good, there is nothing simpler. And it costs you nothing but a few minutes and a little heat you were likely making anyway. My mother did this near every evening with the day's leftover bread, and we children thought it fresh-baked every night. Now, let us speak of the breadcrumb, for the breadcrumb is perhaps the single most useful thing a stale loaf becomes, and a kitchen that keeps a jar of good dry breadcrumbs on hand is a kitchen ready for 100 good dishes. When your bread is too far gone even to revive, when it has gone truly hard and dry, that is the perfect bread for crumbs. You break it up and you grind it on a grater or crushed with a rolling pin or in whatever way you have into fine crumbs, and you dry them thoroughly, spreading them out or giving them a spell in a low oven, and then you keep them in a jar with a tight lid where they will last for weeks and weeks. And what will you do with them? Why, you will coat your cutlets and your fried fish and your croquettes with them for a crisp golden crust. You will sprinkle them over a casserole with a little butter to make a fine brown top. You will stir them into your meatballs and your meatloaf, where they hold the meat together and keep it tender and stretch it further, so that a pound of meat feeds more mouths. You will thicken a sauce with them or a stuffing. There is scarcely a week goes by in our kitchen that the breadcrumb jar is not called upon, and every crumb in it came from bread that the world would have thrown away. Close cousin to the crumb is the crouton, and here we use bread that is stale but not yet rock hard. You cut your stale bread into small cubes, toss them with a little melted butter or oil and perhaps a pinch of salt or a rubbing of herbs, and toast them in the oven until they are golden and crisp all the way through. Scattered over a bowl of soup or a salad, These little cubes of crisp seasoned bread are a delight, and folks pay dear for them in a store when they might make far better ones at home from a loaf they were about to discard. A stale loaf makes a great many croutons, and kept dry in a jar they last a good long while. Now I come to the dishes that are the true glory of stale bread, the ones where fresh bread will not do at all, and only the stale loaf serves, and the first of these is the bread pudding. This is a dish born entirely of thrift, a way our grandmothers turned dry bread and a few eggs and a little milk and sugar into a warm, sweet pudding fit to end any meal. And it is one of the great comforts of the old kitchen. You tear your stale bread into pieces and lay them in a dish. You beat together eggs and milk and a little sugar and whatever sweet spices you favor, cinnamon and nutmeg being the old favorites, and perhaps a handful of raisins, and you pour this custard over the bread and let it sit until the bread has drunk it all up and gone soft. Then you bake it until it is set and golden and the whole kitchen smells of it, and you serve it warm. And here is the thing. This dish will not work with fresh bread. Fresh bread goes to paste when it is soaked. It is the dryness of the stale loaf, its firmness, that lets it drink up the custard and yet hold its shape and its texture, and so this beloved dish exists only because of stale bread. The thing the modern world throws away is the very thing this treasure is made from. The same is true of that breakfast dish the French rightly named lost bread, for it was made to save bread that would otherwise be lost, what most folks now call French toast. Fresh bread is too soft for it and falls apart. Stale bread, firm and thirsty, soaks up the egg and milk and holds together and fries up to a thing far better than any fresh slice could become. Once again, the stale loaf is not second best here, it is required, and it is the same yet again with the old dishes where bread is soaked and cooked into the very body of a soup or a savory pudding, thickening it, giving it substance, turning a thin broth into a hearty meal. In many an old country there is a soup made of little more than stale bread, water or broth, a bit of fat, some onion or garlic, and it has fed poor families for centuries, and it is honestly delicious, the humble stale loaf swelling and softening and thickening the pot into something that sticks to the ribs on a cold day. Bread was long the thickener of the poor kitchen, cheaper than any other, and a stale loaf stirred into a stew or a soup will thicken it beautifully and add its own good flavor besides. And I must not forget the stuffing, or the dressing as some call it, that dish of seasoned bread that goes alongside a roast bird or a good supper, for it is perhaps the most beloved of all the ways we use old bread. You take your stale bread, cubed and dried, and you toss it with softened onion and celery cooked in butter, with herbs, with salt and pepper, and you moisten it all with a little broth and bake it, and you have a dish that many a person loves better than the meat it accompanies. And it must be stale bread, for fresh would turn to mush. The old cooks knew to save up their bread ends and heels for weeks before a feast day, drying them and keeping them, precisely so they would have enough good stale bread for a proper stuffing. Nothing was wasted, and the waste of one day became the feast of another. There are smaller uses too, little clever tricks the old kitchen knew, and I will give you a few for good measure. A slice of stale bread dropped into the jar, where your brown sugar has gone hard as a rock will over a day or two, give up its moisture to the sugar and soften it again, and the same slice will keep a fresh soft sugar from hardening in the first place. A piece of stale bread tucked into the tin with your cookies or your cake helps keep them moist and fresh, giving of its own moisture to protect them. A crust of dry bread is a fine thing to give a teething child to gnaw on, or to a dog to keep his teeth clean, in reason. And a bit of soft bread, pressed gently, was long used by careful housewives to lift crumbs from a tablecloth or to gently clean a surface too delicate for water. None of these will change your life, but together they show the spirit of the thing, which is that a resourceful person finds a use for everything and wastes nothing, and that even the humblest scrap has more good left in it than we, in our hurry, ever stop to see. Now, when even you have made your crumbs and your croutons and your puddings, and there is still some bread beyond all use, still it need not be wasted, for there are the animals. The chickens will be glad of it, and the pigs, and the dog, in reason. In the old farmyard, no scrap of bread ever truly reached the end of its usefulness, for what could not feed the family fed the creatures who, in turn, fed the family. And the very last crumbs, if it comes to that, may be scattered for the wild birds, who will thank you with their songs. There is a kind of completeness to it, a circle with no waste in it anywhere, that I find deeply satisfying, and that the modern way, with its bin full of good food thrown out, has lost entirely. Let me give you now the honest caution that must go with all of this, for there is one line you must never cross, and it is the line between stale and moldy. Stale bread, as I have told you, is a fine and useful thing, safe and good, mealy, firm and dry, and everything I have taught you today is about stale bread. Moldy bread is another matter altogether, and moldy bread you must throw away, all of it, without hesitation. And I must warn you against a thing that many folks do in their thrift, thinking it wise, which is to cut the moldy spot off a loaf and use the rest. Do not do this with bread. Bread is soft and open inside, and the mold you see as a spot on the surface has sent its roots, invisible to your eye, threading all through the soft loaf far beyond the spot. And some molds, as they grow, make substances that are not good for a body at all, and that a little cooking will not destroy. So with a soft bread, once you see mold, the whole loaf goes out, not just the spot. This is different from a hard cheese or a firm thing, where cutting away the mold and a margin around it can be safe, because the mold cannot easily root through the density of it. But bread is soft, and mold runs through it, and so moldy bread is thrown away entire. Keep your bread dry and cool and well wrapped, and use it up in good time, and it will go stale, which is useful, long before it goes moldy, which is not. And if ever you are in doubt, if a loaf smells off or shows the least fuzz of mold, do not risk it. Bread is cheap and your health is dear. Now let me say a word about the keeping of bread, for the best way to save a stale loaf is partly to keep your bread from going stale too fast in the first place, and here there is an old wisdom and a common modern mistake worth setting straight. A great many people, meaning, keep their bread in the cold box, the refrigerator, thinking the cold will preserve it, but I will tell you a curious truth that the men of science have confirmed. The cold box actually stales bread faster, not slower. That very change in the starch I spoke of, the change that makes a loaf go firm and dull, happens quickest at the cool temperature of the refrigerator, quicker than at room temperature. So bread kept in the cold box goes stale before its time. The old way was better. Keep your bread at room temperature in a bread box or a crock or wrapped in a cloth, where it breathes a little but does not dry too fast, and it will stay good longer than in the cold box. And if you have more bread than you can eat before it stales, the answer is not the refrigerator but the freezer. For freezing, unlike merely chilling, stops that starch change cold in its tracks, and a loaf frozen fresh and then thawed and warmed comes back near to new. So freeze what you cannot use soon. Keep the rest at room temperature, and never trust your good bread to the cold box, which does it no favors at all. In our kitchen there has always stood a crock or a jar set aside for the ends and heels and odd stale pieces, and into it they go as they come, the crust nobody wanted, the last 2 slices gone firm, the bit left from a meal. It sits and it fills, the pieces drying as they wait, and when it is full or when a dish calls for it, there is the bread ready to become crumbs or stuffing or pudding. This simple habit, this one crock kept for the purpose, is really the whole secret of never wasting bread, for it means the stale pieces are gathered and saved as a matter of course, rather than thrown out in the moment for lack of a plan. Keep such a crock, and let every family member know that stale bread goes into it and not into the bin, and you will find you always have good dry bread on hand for the 100 uses I have named, and you will marvel that you ever threw such a useful thing away. I remember a time in my boyhood when a neighbor family, new to our ways, was visited by my grandmother, and this neighbor woman went to throw out near half a loaf gone hard, apologizing that she had let it get away from her. My grandmother, gentle as she was, would not hear of it. She sat that woman down at her own table, and in one afternoon showed her the reviving of a loaf, the making of crumbs, and a bread pudding set to bake, all from that one supposedly ruined half a loaf. And by evening, the neighbor family sat down to a warm pudding made of the very bread they had been about to throw in the bin. I have never forgotten the look on that woman's face, the surprise of it, the small delight of having been shown that what she took for waste was in fact the makings of a treat. That is what I hope to do for you today, across all these years and miles. To show you, as my grandmother showed that neighbor, that the loaf you are about to discard is a gift, if only you know how to receive it. Let me gather it all together for you now. A stale loaf is not waste, but treasure. First, you can revive it whole with a little moisture and a hot oven, bringing it back near to fresh for a day. When it is too far for that, you can grind it into breadcrumbs and keep them in a jar for coating and topping and binding and thickening 100 dishes. You can cube and toast it into croutons for your soups and salads. You can make it into bread pudding and into lost bread, those sweet dishes that fresh bread cannot make. You can cook it into the body of a soup or a savory pudding to thicken and enrich the pot. You can turn it into stuffing to grace a feast. And what remains beyond all that can feed the chickens and the pigs and the dog and the wild birds, so that nothing at all is truly wasted. Only remember the one hard line, that stale is good, but moldy is thrown away entire, the whole loaf and not just the spot. Learn these ways, and you will never again toss a loaf into the bin. You will look at yesterday's bread and see not the end of something, but the beginning of a dozen good things. There is something larger here than bread, if you will hear an old man say so. Bread has been, for nearly all of human history, the very staff of life, the thing our grandparents prayed over and worked for and never, ever wasted, for they knew what it was to be without it. To throw good bread in the bin would have seemed to them not merely wasteful, but almost a kind of sin, an ingratitude, a forgetting of how dear the daily loaf truly is. And I think when we lost the knowing of how to use every scrap of it, we lost a little of that gratitude too, a little of that reverence for our food and for the labor and the goodness that brought it to our table. So when you save that stale loaf and turn it into breadcrumbs or pudding or stuffing, you are doing more than saving a few pennies, real as those pennies are. You are keeping faith with a very old wisdom and with a very old thankfulness, and I believe you will feel the better for it. Try even one of these ways this week with a loaf you would have thrown out, and I think you will be surprised both at how good it is and at how good it feels. If this is the kind of good old useful wisdom you have been hungry for, the kind that makes you a little more capable and a little more thrifty and connects you back to the good sense of those who came before us, then stay here with me. There is a great deal more where this came from, and I aim to bring it back to you, one piece at a time. Subscribe, and we will keep remembering the old ways together, because some of the most precious things we ever knew are the simple ones we let ourselves forget. And the honoring of good bread, down to its very last crumb, is surely one of them.